Good evening, everyone. My name is Afrodita Hakai, and I'm the Assistant Director here for the Center for International Human Rights. And on behalf of the Center, I would like to welcome you all to this evening's event. Our event today is titled, A Promise to a Promise, Time for Action to End Violence Against Women. Tonight's event has been organized to celebrate International Women's Day. The purpose of this year's theme, Ending Violence Against Women, is to promote ongoing efforts at the national level as well as the global level, share experiences and innovations in delivering commitments to women and girls all over the world, and support efforts and strategies, particularly at the national level, which really lead upon efforts in increasing investments for women, for gender equality and empowerment issues. The UN designated theme has been chosen this year. However, it still raises critical issues. I will briefly highlight some of the issues in my welcoming remarks. First, we will look at the main challenges that are confronted by victims of violence. In looking at these challenges, we will examine some of the initiatives that have been undertaken to combat violence against women. The second issue will attempt to examine who are the key stakeholders in these undertakings and how effective they are. Moreover, how can access to justice for women be ensured? Lastly, and worth noting, is what can be done to enable women to advance to the maximum of their potential and contribute more effectively to public life. These are some of the issues that our distinguished group of panelists who have accepted our invitation to participate in this evening's event will be addressing. Before I give the floor to Professor Rosemary Barbaret, who will be chairing tonight's event and introducing the panelists, I would like to thank all those who made this event possible. First of all, of course, our distinguished panelists, thank you very much for being here today, and we welcome your remarks. Also, the Center staff, thanks for your organized help in organizing this event. And in particular, someone who could not be here today is Professor George Andriopoulos, who is currently traveling abroad on a business trip, but he sends everyone his greetings. He's also the Center director. I would like to also thank the co-sponsors of this event. The bachelor's degree in International Criminal Justice, as well as the master's degree in International Crime and Justice. We're fortunate to have the program director, Professor Rosemary Barbaret, here with us today, and the Gender Studies Department here at John Jay College. One last thing before I give the floor to Professor Barbaret. In the back of the room, we have some brochures, so please help yourself and take some of the brochures and be more familiar with some of the other topic and issue areas that our center works on. And in addition, if you're not already enlisted in our listserv, please sign your name in the sheet in the back of the room so that we can keep you up to date with future events. Without further ado, I would like to thank you all again for being here tonight. And I will give the floor to Professor Barbaret, who will chair the panel and lead a discussion. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm very happy to be here tonight, and I'm happy to be meeting new colleagues, people who are doing very important work in this area and are helping us celebrate an early International Women's Day. I represent the International Sociological Association at the United Nations, and this week and next week is the Commission on the Status of Women meetings. And there are over 6,000 women's NGO activists registered for these meetings. So it is a huge gathering place for activists as well as for government officials, obviously. And I'm glad that we're doing our part here at John Jay to have our own panel with scholars and activists to give us very important presentations on what is the main theme this year at the UN Commission on the Status of Women, violence against women and girls. Our presenters are going to speak for about 10 to 12 minutes each, and I'll be monitoring the time. And after that, we'll have Q&A for about half an hour, and then we have some lovely refreshments in the back, I understand. So I'd like first to call on Dr. Lacey Sloan. She is professor in the Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work Department at the College of Staten Island, and she herself is a social worker. She has over 20 years experience working at local, state, and national levels to end violence against women, and in fact, she's just come back from Qatar, working in the same area for 2.5 years, so she has some international experience as well, and we're very eager to have her reflections tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, well then I'll stand up. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here. I was kind of surprised when I got the invitation, but delighted that being in New York City and Staten Island is paying off. I've only been here a couple of years, as you said. I've just come back from Qatar. But I started working in rape crisis back in 1985 on the Mexican-United States border in Texas, in southern Texas. I was also fortunate enough to to attend the 1995 UN Conference on Women in Beijing. I went there as a former sex worker to a coalition with other sex workers around the world for sex workers' rights. And I have continued, actually became involved in that fight because of my work in sexual violence. I am both a rape survivor and I am a former sex worker. When I first started in 1985 in the sexual violence movement, most of our states did not even have model sexual assault laws. Since that time, most states have revised their rape laws to reflect the real nature of sexual assault being an attack and an act of violence rather than something that really has a sexual component. And also, since that time, we have passed the Violence Against Women Act, 1995, which was just signed by Obama today, a reauthorization of that act. That really changed the whole playing ground in the field of violence against women in the United States. Once that act was passed, we got federal funds to help victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking find the services that they need from non-governmental organizations as well as law enforcement and criminal justice to try and receive appropriate services with dignity and respect that did not accuse them of false allegations and understood the real serious nature of these offenses and how difficult and shaming and stigmatizing it can be to come forward. One of the interesting things that I have discovered is that we believe that the increase in law enforcement training, prosecutor training, judges training, the expansion of domestic violence shelters, especially long-term facilities that allow women and their children to stay long enough to actually secure employment and housing on their own, that most of this has happened since the Violence Against Women Act was passed. And actually one of the facts that I found is that from 1995 to 2005, there was actually a decrease in the number of sexual assaults reported to law enforcement, which is believed to actually reflect a true decrease in this crime. It kind of is consistent with the decrease in other crime statistics. So we have gone from 5 women per every 1,000 experiencing sexual assault to less than 2 women per 1,000 experiencing sexual assault, and that number has stayed constant for from 2005 to 2010. I don't know the last 3 years worth of data. Again, overall violent crime has fallen, and there's a lot of reasons why we think that's true, including a decrease in the population that typically commits violent crimes, young people 15 to 24, and so on. At the same time that there has been a decrease in what we believe is a decrease in sexual assault, the reporting has not actually stayed even. We still see about 1 in 3, now about 1 in 3 sexual assaults are reported to law enforcement, but very few of those end up with an arrest or a prosecution. When I started doing this 28 years ago, the statistics that we usually touted were 1 in 10 women would report their offense. And now from national surveys in which the general public is surveyed and we're able to identify people who've been sexually assaulted and how many of them report, it's right around 1 in 3. Right now, again, about 35%. There are a lot of things that serve as barriers to reporting sexual assault, and certainly one is the belief that we may not be believed. One of my greatest accomplishments, I feel like, in life, in fact, I could retire now as far as I'm concerned, even though the problem's not solved, is that back in 1986, we became aware as a state coalition in Texas of the problem of polygraphing rape victims. Plays right into the whole idea that women frequently lie about being raped, which goes way back to Old English law. We were never able to get that practice abolished in Texas, but when I moved to New York in '95, we did get it abolished here in New York. I then moved to Arkansas. We totally rewrote the penal code there. It was very outdated. And then when VAWA was reauthorized in 2004, they adopted a rule that said any state that receives federal money under VAWA cannot allow rape victims to be polygraphed. So that practice, with the stroke of a pen, has now been abolished in the United States, which I think says a lot for what the type of education we've been able to do from the local level all the way to the national level. Unfortunately, violence against women internationally is rampant. As you mentioned, I was able to spend a few years in Qatar and become much more familiar with the situation facing women in this very conservative Islamic country. There was finally research that reports that indeed about 25% of all Qatari women are victims of domestic violence, women and girls, many times not only at the hands of their husbands, but often at their brothers, because in that country, women are still very much controlled by their male relatives, even though the women that I taught felt very empowered. And part of that was because of the work of Sheikh Hamoza, who is the Emir's wife, who's been very active in promoting equality for women, education, cultural expansion, museums and things like that in the country, as well as heading up the expansion of social services for victims of trafficking, victims of sexual assault, sexual assault, kind of an interesting situation in Qatar, but certainly domestic violence and stalking. Actually, the sexual assault rates for Qatari women, according to the law there, are fairly rare. Women are so chaperoned that there is little opportunity for strangers to ever approach them. They don't date, so date rape's kind of out of the question, where they're most likely to be victimized by a family member or an acquaintance, which is true here in the US as well. But the rates of that report are very low. Qatar, like many Islamic countries, does not recognize marital rape because under the Quran, women are to submit themselves to their husband, although men are not supposed to force themselves on their wives. So there is a lot of work that still needs to be done on that particular issue in Qatar and around the Middle East. Female genital mutilation, which I know one of our speakers is going to talk about, remains a prevalent problem in the Middle East, even though it's not practiced in Qatar. It does happen from Egypt all the way down to about Ethiopia on the east coast of Africa. I certainly, having many immigrants in Qatar, worked with the victims of female genital mutilation, and again, even though it's not an Islamic practice, it is not something sanctioned by law, it is not uncommon, especially for women coming from rural areas in Egypt and, again, kind of on the east coast of Africa. We also have a problem with early marriage of girls. For the most part, at least where I was at in Qatar, women are not forced to marry, but arranged marriages are the norm, and marriages to cousins are prioritized. First cousins are the priority. But women do actually have to tell the judge 3 times that they agreed to the marriage. And I know that because I ended up getting married when I was in Qatar. And interestingly enough, I was not able to agree to be married on my own. Since I didn't have a male relative who was Islamic, the judge had to take custody of me for the day and grant my husband permission to marry me, even though he's half my age. So there is a lot of control of women's behavior. Oh, actually, I also had to put in my marriage contract that I was allowed to travel, work, and drive a car and a motorcycle without his permission. But you can put things like that in your marriage contract. But again, a lot of freedoms are lacking for women around the world. And one of the big things that has come to light probably over the past 10 years has been the problem of trafficking. Women do make up the bulk of people who are trafficked around the world. One of the good pieces of news is that trafficking of women has decreased, but trafficking of girls has increased. About 10%. We went from about 20% of detected victims being girls to about 27% of detected victims being girls. And I think that's a real important thing to note, is that we talk about detected victims because it's very, very difficult for people to identify as victims of trafficking, and two, for law enforcement to recognize victims of trafficking. And I think that's probably particularly true for victims of sex trafficking. All trafficking is not about sex, even when women are trafficked. In Qatar, one of the common problems for women there is trafficking is housekeepers. And from the Philippines primarily, they come thinking they're going to maybe be a nanny, be a housekeeper, work 40 hours a week, and they end up being on the clock basically 24/7, are physically abused by the children and the parents. It is very difficult for people who are in those situations to have any time away from their families, and they cannot leave the country. Even I couldn't leave the country without permission from their employer. So if they want to escape, it's very difficult, despite the existence of an incredible anti-trafficking agency in the country. One of the things that I just want to probably wrap up, that we've had 135 countries enact legislation regarding trafficking of both men and women, and of course girls. In the United States, we've obviously adopted those anti-trafficking laws. We have special visas in the United States that have all come about in about, I guess, the past 10 years, maybe a little bit longer, on the trafficking visa, where a victim of trafficking can actually apply for a special visa that will allow her or him to stay in the country. There has been a process in the United States that I actually disagree with as a sex workers' rights activist, and that is that some states have started adopting laws that claim that all recruitment into sex industry is a form of trafficking. That is not what the international laws say, and that is not what even the United States law says, although the United States has recently taken a stance that sex work is not a legitimate profession, even though the bulk of the world still recognizes sex work as just that, a legitimate profession in which women and men can sell their genitals as well as I, as professor, can sell my mind. So I think as a sex worker, we've been very active in the anti-trafficking movement. We don't want women who are forced into sex work to be there. It's the same thing as being raped every time you turn a trick. If that's not something you want to do, it is a rape because you have been forced to do it. And I think that we need to recognize that. It's not just trafficking into a misdemeanor offense of prostitution. It is a form of rape, and many times a form of torture, and certainly serious control by others. I think that we have got to train our law enforcement in how to reach out to all sex workers, no matter whether they're the high-end call girls or they're the street workers, to make sure that those women are not victims of trafficking. And I think one of the things that law enforcement really needs to do is adopt a more supportive relationship with sex workers who are frequently victims of domestic violence and sexual assault by their customers, as well as by their boyfriends or partners or other people in their lives. We have got to protect even women who are doing illegal activities, again, the misdemeanor of prostitution. I found the same thing when I was working on the Texas-Mexico border with migrant workers and undocumented immigrants. They were extremely vulnerable to victimization by their employers and co-workers and anyone else in the community because they were undocumented, and at that point felt as though they would not get the support they needed if they reported their offenses. Again, fortunately now we have moved in the past 28 years to recognize that even undocumented immigrants can be victims on our soil. The last thing I want to talk about, if I still have time, is one of the big things about today's VAWA Act is that it extends some really important protections to Native women. Up to this point, under federal law, if a woman who is on a reservation is abused by someone who is not part of that tribe, they could not prosecute that offender. If it was a sexual assault, it is a federal crime if it occurs on the reservation. But we have very few, thank you, federal agents. And so most sexual assaults against Native women are never prosecuted. The highest offense a tribe could give was 1 year. So now, one of the big problems with VAWA, the conflict was about extending jurisdictions of tribes to allow them to protect the people who live on their reservation, whether they are Native or not. And there's a lot of people who do live on reservations who aren't Native. So if you victimize a Native woman now, as of today, you will be held liable by the tribes in addition to the federal government. And I think that that's a really good place to move. We've also adopted additional services for gay and lesbian victims. We know that lesbians and gay men are victimized about the same rate as heterosexuals. So we're finally understanding, through all of this time, that we have really got to reach out to marginalized populations and provide them effective, appropriate services, which means more than just the right kind of hair care products. Thank you.
Thank you for that very enthusiastic and knowledge-packed 10 minutes. Thank you, Dr. Sloan. I'd now like to call on Ms. Sethu Nair, who is the Manager of Community Education and Media Relations at Saki for South Asian Women, a major player in the anti-domestic violence movement here in New York City.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Yeah? It's not a very scary PowerPoint presentation. While they set it up, I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Sethu Nair. I do all of the community education, organizing, mobilizing work at Saki for South Asian Women, in addition to some of my favorite other things, media and communications work. Saki, I don't know how many people here know Saki. Can you raise your hand? I just want to get a sense of who knows about Saki. That's great. That's wonderful. So I don't have a very long talk prepared for you. I just, before anything else, I'd love for all of you to just stand up. Is that okay? How many of you have been sitting all day today? Me, yeah? And this is nothing related to my talk. If you could just sort of move around a little bit, just shake out your arms and take a deep breath. My God, these things are so hard to talk about, and it's so important to just let yourself be. And it's also a storm, which fortunately is not too much of a storm. So if you want to also just look at other people around you, we're a world full of people, not just ourselves. I've noticed that I've gotten lost in my computer all the time, so I forget the other people sometimes. So thank you. Have a seat. Okay, one more activity. How many people here have gone through some form of violence or abuse of any kind, or know somebody else who has? Yeah, just take a look around the room. That's just about everybody, and and if you don't have that experience and somebody sitting right next to you does, So usually when I speak, this is an activity I like to do only because often we think that these are issues, violence against women and gender-based violence are issues, things that happen to other people who are not us and not connected to us. And so in a way there is a lack of accountability and a lack of action that we feel in our daily lives. So is it possible to just go back to I can do it myself if I can just, the first slide, it just really just says that. So that's really just what I wanted to generally talk about today, accountability and action. And I'm not going to define violence against women. You've done a really great job of highlighting domestic violence, sexual assault, trafficking, and so many other issues, so I'm not going to do all of that. But because this is such an issue, one of my primary interests in my work is to make sure that we all have a sense of how personal this issue is. This is International Women's Day CSW-related talks, and we have to remember, while there are these talks going on in the United Nations, these talks happen because violence happens, and happens every day, and it happens everywhere. So with that in mind, I'd like to just talk a little bit about my work. I mostly do a lot of community work. So I go out into neighborhoods and talk to people about violence, and it's really, really difficult. Domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and what happens, why it happens, and engaging people to take some form of action around it, which simply could mean talking about it out loud to yourself, or having discussions in your neighborhoods, in your families. A lot of grassroots work, essentially. And in that regard, one of the most exciting things that we've done over the last year is a play. There's a play called Blanketed by Blame, which essentially, I wish I could have it played out here, I don't have all the tools, but it's essentially a play that helps you understand that there are negative attitudes and there are positive attitudes that we can have that impact violence as it happens in our lives. So essentially, the play is very interesting because there's a character in the middle, a woman, and she is surrounded by people, her people, essentially, her mom, her son sometimes, her father-in-law, or police officer, or an advocate at an organization. And it's really interesting because everyone stands in a circle, and the first round of the play is each person has a blanket in their hands, and each community member goes around and says something. So her mother says something as a response to what she's saying, that I've been abused, something is going on in my life. The mother, for example, the first round is basically our usual negative responses to these things. So the mother, for example, would say something like, this is something that's part of marriage. This is something that's part of your relationship. This is something you just have to, I put up with this, so you have to put up with this too, and it's going to be okay, it's just part of life. And then she puts a blanket over her daughter's head. Similarly, she'll go to a church or a temple member, which is not usually likely that a woman would go into a church readily to talk about these issues, but that person is a representative of somebody in the community. And that person will say something like, well, to maintain just the family situation, to make sure that your children are not badly affected by you talking about this, why don't you just, keep it quiet? Well, this is just part of what you do as a woman. This is part of life. And he puts a blanket over her. So, in that way, there are about as many characters as you want around. And each time someone says something like that, you or me, whether it's the fight I saw on the subway on my way here today, you or me as a relative, as a friend, as a bystander, as a person who happens to be around, we all have these attitudes, and we feel sometimes that we can't do anything about it, that we can't help, that, we feel there's a lack of accountability that we have on our part. And it's a very complex thing. There's an amazing study on bystander intervention about what people around a person experiencing violence or going through something can and can't do. Later on, if you're interested, I can give you some resources about what bystander intervention is and what individuals can do. So in the play, the second part of so essentially all of the community members around her, all of her people have put these blankets over her, so she's standing there affected and, just covered by blanket over blanket over blanket and unable to speak and do and move. And then the second part of the play is so, so powerful because it's the same group of people who have now decided to be more positive to her in nothing but their attitudes and their behaviors towards her. Can you just go to the slide, the next slide, that one. So this is the play that was in action that we did in Richmond Hill and we're trying to replicate in other places. So essentially, that woman over there, Maya, is the woman in the middle, and those people who are volunteers and just audience members were standing around putting blankets over her. The second part of the play is really powerful because each of these members they say something positive, like the mother will say something like, I went through these things myself, and because of that, I know that this is not something that you should have to experience. This is not something, there's something that we can do from our experience of this together. And simply saying that is incredibly supportive and positive and helpful to her. So the mother symbolically removes the blanket she placed. And similarly, she'll go to the community leader, and the community leader will say, well, you know, it is a very challenging thing. I don't know how to deal with this, but I know your husband or your mother-in-law or your father-in-law, and I can talk to them, or if you're interested, I can have a group conversation, or maybe I can talk about it in our temple, try to do something about making sure our community is aware that these things happen in our lives and these things should not be happening. So the community member will then, again, symbolically take off the blanket. So in action, it's a very, very powerful play because you can see like what huge difference it makes in the life of one person when we shift our attitudes and our behaviors. And in that way, we are positively accountable. You know, like we actually are able to, which really just means that we take some kind of action. And so, you know, whether it's looked at on an international, you know, the international level or national level or on a community level or even right here, you know, among us individuals, it's really possible to envision that you can do something about violence against women, that you can do something about domestic violence. And, you know, just think of those people you were thinking of when you raised your hands. Like, you don't have to share any of this here if you don't want to, but what could you have done? How could you have responded? How could you have helped? These are really important things. So that's really what I really wanted to, the message I wanted to send across today, to recognize that it isn't just an issue that is outside of us, that is happening in the UN where people are talking about what's to be done globally, or even in the center. You know, it's not just a academic issue, it's actually a real life experience issue, and let's not forget that it touches all of our lives. With that, I will tell you a little bit more about the kind of work that Sakhi does, where we take actions of all different kinds. Well, this was supposed to be the last slide, but it's this very exciting, timely slide. This was today, the Violence Against Women Act that she talked about was passed, and that over there is Dilema Jayasinghe, our executive director. She was in Washington, and we didn't really get close to the president, but it was really exciting to get a picture from far away. The legislation, you talked greatly about it, so I won't really go into it very much. On a national level, you know, I'm really proud that the act passed today. There was so much debate about it over the last couple of weeks. If you're interested in learning more about that, you can really just Google it. It's very simple. Just Googled VAWA, Violence Against Women Act. But essentially there are, you know, I think our current president, Vice President Joe Biden, drafted this legislation, and very progressive-mindedly. And it's been largely useful and effective for a lot of really great work that's been done in the United States to combat or respond to domestic violence and sexual assault. There are also at the same time, there is a tendency to look at federal legislation and laws and legalities as a solution, an end solution to all of the problems that are going on in the country. And just like nothing works that way, this legislation also does not work that way. It does not solve all of our problems. It does not really respond. It doesn't even support all of the organizations that do really great work, essentially. Oh, okay. No problem. So it's important to remember that, you know, federal legislations are great, but they're not necessarily always responsive to issues that go on in our lives. And if I could just go back to that, one more, and one more. This is so the economic. So last year, Sakhi worked with the Manhattan Borough President's Office to put together an economic abuse report. Economic abuse is a form of violence against women that often does not get even thought about. It's basically financial control, who controls the money in a household, in a relationship, where who has access, how do they move about finances in the family. So in our work, we found that there were a lot of women who are coming up to us who had who had never accessed credit in their entire life, and they wanted to go to school or buy a house, and they would try to access credit for the first time, only to find out that they had really bad credit, maxed bad credit. So we tried to do a little bit of investigation within our organization, and then we wondered if other organizations are experiencing similar things. So we gathered, with the help of the Manhattan Borough President's Office, we were able to work with about 10 to 15 other organizations, and we all basically went and looked into our files to see if things of the sort were happening. And of course, we found out that it was happening. And we put together this report, and this is one of those actions we've taken in advocacy that I feel is really, really significant and important, because the report has been created. Now we have numbers to say that this happens, fantastic, but what next? So one of the things we're doing with this report is using this report to advocate that that economic abuse be part of the definition of domestic violence legally. So and then the importance of that is that if there is a case that comes up where a woman is saying, well, you know, he maxed out my credit card and now I can't access what I need to move forward in my life, legally, you know, whenever that gets accepted legally, there would be an option to hold this person accountable. So I just highlighted some of the work that we do at Sakhi. I wish I had more time. If you want to talk to me, I will be here. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderfully accessible presentation, and also for the very innovative things that your organization is doing. I'd now like to call on Hannah Pennington, who's Executive Director at Mayor Bloomberg's Office to Combat Domestic Violence, specifically the Manhattan Family Justice Center, scheduled to open next fall. Thank you.
Hi everyone. So sorry I was late. It was one of those days. It's the weather, I don't know. But VAWA happened today, so it can't be a bad day, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the mayor's office does, but most specifically about the family justice centers. But you know, I just wanted to start, which I think everybody's touching on. I do think it is so remarkably significant that VAWA happened today, but not because VAWA happened, but because VAWA was expanded again to finally include more victims and all victims, which is really important on a day like today, and really important because of why you all probably came, because you care about human rights. So if that's what this was all about to begin with, and this was not something that wasn't talked about when this all happened way back when, but the fact that it finally happened is exciting. It's also pretty telling that even though there is so much work being done, and I'm going to give you all sorts of exciting things that we're doing at the city level, it's astounding that in our own country, because again, it's International Women's Day, but we're talking about in our own country, that it took this long to get a more inclusive VAWA passed. So I think it's both exciting, but pretty astounding. So anyways, I'm excited to be here. And I'm sorry to make you click, but if you don't mind. I'm just going to really focus on these statistics on some things that I think are really important before I get into some of the program descriptions. That only 27% of women report abuse to law enforcement. I think that's really important for people to know when I get to the numbers of clients that we're serving and that all these agencies are serving. Another one that's really important for me whenever I talk to folks is that, and this number stays the same, or you know, pretty much around the same, that 72% of New York City domestic violence fatality victims had no prior police contact. So we need to make sure that people know there's help, because I don't need to explain that to you. 263,000 domestic violence incidents were reported in 2012. That means over 720 per day. Also pretty astounding. Also, again, I'm always a little bit of a balanced person, but that's a good thing too, because it's a big number and it's a grave number, but it also means that people all are calling the police, which, as we all know, a lot of people probably still aren't, but there were people who weren't that are now. And then also that the domestic violence hotline run by the city answers almost 300 calls per day, too. Next slide. So the Mayor's Office to Combat Domestic Violence, which is something we should be proud of in New York because it's not something that exists in most cities. It's a government office that's focused specifically on domestic violence. It was started in 2001 when the voters voted to amend the charter, and my boss, Yolanda Jimenez, was appointed as the commissioner and is still the commissioner. We do a lot of things. Again, I'm going to focus on the Family Justice Centers, but I just wanted to point out some of the other things we do, which is the obvious things you would do at in the mayor's office in terms of policy and advocacy and coordination of services around the city. But we also coordinate a Healthy Relationship Academy, which is run by folks who go out and teach peers of teens who are experiencing this or could be experiencing these kinds of things. You know, they can get a workshop in their school or they can get a workshop in their program around the city, which is exciting. And then also, because of a law change in 2005, the OCDV also coordinates a fatality review committee that gathers statistics from the police department about fatalities, but also city agencies, and analyzes that data and sits with a committee of folks to look at what's happening and to see trends and figure out what we can do. And also exciting on the state level, they just implemented a state fatality review committee, which is going to be a little bit different than the city, which is really based on gathering data and looking at it, the big picture. This is actually designed to choose a small number of cases each year and review that fatality and talk to family members and talk to community members and try to figure out what happened and why there was a fatality. So the Family Justice Centers is a public-private initiative, and some of you may know about it, but if you don't, I can give you just in a nutshell that it's a one-stop shop, essentially, for domestic violence victims, trafficking victims, and elder abuse victims. It's a national model. It started in San Diego, and they all look a little different. Even in our own state of New York, they look a little different, but in New York City, we are housed with the county district attorney's office. So a victim who either comes first to meet with the prosecutor or hears about the center and knows it's a walk-in center can come, they can meet with the prosecutor, but they cannot meet with the prosecutor. They can just meet with folks on the social service side. They can meet with an immigration attorney. They can meet with a counselor. Their children can get counseling. Their children can do children's activities in the children's room. They can meet with someone from the Human Resource Administration for the City of New York if they have a public benefit issue, that sort of thing. And it's also important, especially for folks who don't know about it, and I think some of us were at a conference earlier this week where we were talking about, you know, what is going on and is VAWA enough or did VAWA go too far? And we're not going to answer that question tonight, but as a service provider, and previous to this work, I was working at Sanctuary for Families, which is a large organization dedicated to this work, is that making sure, no matter if a client can't leave, doesn't want to leave, wants to leave, everybody is welcome to come. That's the most important thing. And I think that's something to be proud of in New York City because we are an inclusive city. There are still so many problems, but I went to school in New Jersey for law school, so just go to New Jersey if you want to see that things are not the way they are in New York City. And I think that what I was struck when that conversation was happening was that is making sure that my job is making sure that people know they can come no matter where they're coming from, no matter what it is that they want, that they can at least talk to people, they can at least see what their options are. That's the thing that I think is exciting about it. And in fact, I did not look at the clock when I started. Thank you. Okay. I won't go through all these, and this presentation is a little too long, but I think the most important thing on this list and the goals is the culturally linguistic appropriate services, which I think can go, that doesn't just mean culture in the normal sense. That's kind of what I'm talking about here too. It's just meeting a client where they are. That's the most important thing. And then going to the numbers I was referring to before, since the Family Justice Center started, In 2005, 85,000 clients have been served. There's an average of 3,700 visits at the 3 centers that exist already every month. 16,000 children have visited our children's centers. This one I like a lot, that the staff speak over 35 languages. And Language Line, which is a phone service, provides over 150 languages. So there's one in Brooklyn, that was the first in 2005, one in Queens, one in the Bronx, which is actually where I worked for 3 years before taking my new job. And then there's going to be one in Manhattan, and it's going to be housed with the District Attorney's Office for New York County at 80 Center Street. All of the, and Manhattan will look like this too. The centers, as I said, 1/2 of the floor of these centers are the prosecutors who are prosecuting domestic violence crimes, which will be the same in Manhattan. On the other half of the floor are where these other services are provided. I think I'm an attorney, so my favorite is the immigration and family law representation piece, which I can't say representation is found by everybody, because anybody who does this kind of work would tell you that there are not enough attorneys to represent low-income New Yorkers in any area of law. But what's really exciting about the Family Justice Centers is that a person can walk in, and this is something that I did in my old job, and meet with an attorney the day they walk in and find out what the heck is going on. Because a lot of times when you go to court, or you even get a court-assigned attorney, nobody takes 45 minutes to an hour to explain to you what's going on in such a life-altering situation. So that one's really exciting. We have 31 on-site nonprofit partners, and so the way that the centers work is that the city houses partner staff. Of course, the district attorney staff is run by the county district attorney's office, but on the civil side, there's this very small administrative staff that works for the city, but then the rest of the folks who sit in the center actually work for Saki or work for Sanctuary for Families, and either spend all of their time but go home for staff meetings and get their paychecks from Sanctuary, or they spend 1 day a week or every other Thursday, something like that. And we do that so we can get as many people in the building as we can, but also so we can get the range of service providers, so that we also try to link folks with agencies that make sense. For a South Asian woman, they can go to Saki. For a disabled person, they can go to Barrier Free Living. You get the idea. Another thing that I think is really exciting about the model is the city agency partners, and in part because it's not fair to everyone else, but when you come to our center, for example, if you're having a public benefit issue, we have somebody on staff once a week from HRA who's linked into the city system. And if anybody has ever served or helped anybody yourself or in your professional capacity with a public benefit issue, just even waiting online to get to a worker could take 5 hours. So the idea that you come to our center, or even a week before, set up an appointment on a Thursday for a 30-minute appointment with your advocate sitting there with a city worker is a pretty tremendous thing. And I've been doing this since I was in law school, and I have to say that particular model is one that I get excited about, because that was not something that was even remotely possible then. And you don't have to read all these, but that's just so you can see how many there are. I hope Saki's on there. There they are. Okay, good. And then lastly, the centers really started as like a lot of the work in this movement, as a crisis intervention service, but it really grew from there. And our office, like all the agencies that do this work, really have, like the economic abuse report, really have always tried to listen to clients and find out what they need and what's missing or what's wrong. And since 2005, the centers have really shifted from a crisis intervention focus to longer term services. And these are just some examples of things that have been put in place. We work with this fabulous nonprofit called WISE, and 2 or 3 times a year run a financial literacy course for clients, and it runs for 8 weeks every week. There's childcare, there's dinner, and amazing speakers, and a certification process for clients who can then say that they, not only do they get to put it on in their files, but they actually also can get help with troubling credit reports or anything to do with being financially literate. And then another more in the last 2 years, there's actually a computer training program called STEPS at the center, which is a 12-week program, very intensive, and gets a certification for clients, some of whom have never worked with computers before, coming from a totally different line of work. And that's an exciting program, and Do It is a great, Do It as in the Department of Technology for the City of New York has been extremely helpful. And then the Brooke Jackman Foundation, which is actually a woman who was killed on 9/11. Her family started a foundation. She was a finance person who was looking to get into childhood literacy, and so they fund a family literacy program, which again it's an 8-week program run by our children's staff who bring together the parents and the children, and they read books, and they have dinner, and they create projects together and put on shows, and it's really exciting. So I think that's it. That's my contact information. We just hired a deputy, which means I have a team member, which is exciting. And that's it. So thank you, and I'll be around for questions too.
Thank you. I think we all learned a lot that we didn't know, and it's wonderful.